parents at an internment camp in the middle of Arizona. And what do kids know about wars? I was happy to be walking. They said this kid would never walk. And I felt like I was some kind of big deal because an FBI guy carrying a piece, being escorted, The first one we were in was called Gila, Gila, as in the Gila River. It was called the Gila River Internment Center. Well, Uncle Sam and we Americans, we like to use euphemistic words or invent words if we think certain other words are too harsh. So they called them relocation centers. They were America's versions of concentration camps. Anyway, I went there. I stayed about a year and a half, and we moved from Gila to Tule Lake. Tule Lake was right on the border of California and Oregon, way up north on the border. And the reason for that was my grandfather on my mother's side, he, at the time of all this separation when the war broke out, he ended up in Tule Lake with my uncle. And we went to Gila, Arizona. So my mother had this strong feeling that perhaps he may not live through the war, and she wanted to be with him. And so I forget how we did it, but because I was too young to understand those things, but that's how we got transferred to
2 years into World War II, and the United States had still yet to join the war. We had tried to maintain neutrality and prevent engaging in the war. U.S. intelligence knew of a suspected attack that would probably attack some base on the West Coast, but we never thought it would have been from the Japanese. They figured that the Japanese people were genetically less witted than the white race, and they believed because of the eye shape of the Japanese people that they would be unable to manage weapons and fighting and be unable to properly see the enemies ahead of them. They were wrong. The main Pacific U.S. naval base was located in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. If the Japanese eradicated it, then this would eliminate U.S. air and naval presence in the Pacific and be given free access to raw materials from conquered lands such as the Philippines, Malaysia, Dutch East Indies, Hong Kong, Wake Island, Guam, Burma, that the U.S. had cut off goods for to prevent Japanese expansion into the Pacific. In the early morning of December 7th, 1941, it was said to have been a regular day for both Hawaiian and American citizens. They ate breakfast, they went to worship, relaxed outside, spoke with their neighbors, admired the sun. It was said to have been a cloudless day, until about 8 a.m. Hawaii Standard Time, when they heard jets. Bombs landed on the U.S. naval base in Oahu from Japanese planes, attacking airfield and anti-air defenses on the western side of Oahu. Within an hour, another wave of planes flew towards the eastern side. Both waves meet over Pearl Harbor. 8 battleships were damaged, most notably the USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, and the USS Utah. Alongside with 3 destroyers unusable, 3 light cruisers damaged, 160 aircraft destroyed, 128 aircraft damaged, and a U.S. battle fleet out of commission for at the very least 6 months, 2,500 lives were lost. The following day, FDR addressed the nation, and Congress declared war. Later, so would Germany and Italy, fully submerging the U.S. into World War II. While the U.S. began the war with the Japanese peoples in the Pacific, Japanese Americans at home were fighting their own increasing battle of discrimination based on their ethnicity. Both Japanese aliens and Japanese Americans were seen as representative of the country of Japan and its actions during the war that were being increasingly more publicized as the United States got more involved in the Pacific. As a result, Japanese people were seen as a threat to the everyday person and national security. They were turned away from businesses, they were refused homes, and they were refused to be allowed in certain areas. They were refused from jobs. This, unfortunately, is a common occurrence in times of war. After 9/11, there was a large amount of racism and Islamophobia towards Muslim people and towards people of Middle Eastern descent, and in various periods in both World War I and World War II, there was a large amount of anti-German dissent in which people would boycott German-made beers. However, this is a very specifically large instance that kind of shows the full development of discrimination based on one race during a war. After Pearl Harbor had happened, Japanese people were now seen as a threat to national security. Japanese people prior to Pearl Harbor were not seen as a threat because of social Darwinism. We did not believe that they could fight as well as white people could. We didn't believe that they could see with their eyes with the weapons, but now they clearly could, and now they could clearly attack U.S. soil, which hadn't happened before. And so people who had never even set foot in Japan, people born on United States soil, were now seen as a threat to the everyday person and to the security of democracy in America as a whole. This is the origin of Order 9066. That was written into order by President FDR. Order 9066 was a response to the perceived threat of national security, primarily by Japanese Americans, but also affecting German Americans. Any Americans of Japanese ancestry on the West Coast were forced to sell their homes, sell any stores that they owned, sell any belongings they could not fit into, I believe it was 2 suitcases. They were then sent to trains to transport them to the nearest camp. These camps were rows of barracks, not homes, barracks, in which families would have to move into. They were often with a lack of food, with a lack of water, with a lack of proper insulation for whatever weather was in there, often very hot and dry. They were often forced to work on the camps itself. They were held in by barbed wire and guns. However, there was a large feeling that these actions were justified in the name of democracy, that they were needed to protect the nation while it was at war with Japan. There was also a significant amount of propaganda that was being spread, blatantly lying about the situation that these Americans were put in.
When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, our West Coast became a potential combat zone. Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of them American citizens, 1/3 aliens. We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous. But no one knew what would happen among this concentrated population if Japanese forces should try to invade our shores. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move. This picture tells how the mass migration was accomplished. Neither the Army nor the War Relocation Authority relished the idea of taking men, women, and children from their homes, their shops, and their farms. So the military and civilian agencies alike determined to do the job as a democracy should, with real consideration for the people involved.
Simply not true. It was an act of propaganda to better promote this act. The modern day version of Order 9066 could be compared to the Patriot Act. After 9/11, President Bush signed into order the Patriot Act, which, on top of allowing for more surveillance from the government, also allowed for the indefinite detention of immigrants if they were perceived, not proved, to be a threat. They were not given proper rights, trial, or due process. They were held in jails indefinitely without a trial because they were perceived to have been a potential threat to national security, oftentimes not justified. Although occasionally there could have been justifications for holding these immigrants in these detention centers. It can't be said because these people were not held in a court of law. They were just detained. This law has since expired, I believe in 2018. However, these two acts, 9066, and the Patriot Act do set a dangerous precedent for what the government can do in the name of national security, especially in times of war, such as 9/11 and during World War II post-Pearl Harbor. And these continue to be seen to this day with the border crises that have occurred, specifically in Texas, with the detainment of illegal immigrants, specifically children, and the breaking up of families being held in detention centers. And we can see the propaganda too, where there have been a lot of reports that they are held with very comfortable beds and toothpaste and food, but with reporters breaking in and seeing that is in fact not the case. So it is important when these reports come out to keep your eyes peeled for what could be propaganda and what could be the truth and the historical backings behind it.
And at that time, I was 16 years old and not really understanding what was really happening. So as time went on, getting the stories of what had happened to the people, especially the farming families, where they lost their crops and a real financial loss, that began to realize what was really happening relative to this being removed from our homes. A couple of years later, when the draft or when the questionnaire came out, one of the questions was, would I be willing to serve in the armed forces or in the Army? The way the question was stated, I said, if I answered yes, would I really then be volunteering? And not knowing exactly the full implication of that question, I answered no. And then for the next question, whether I would affirm my allegiance to the United States, and I answered yes. So I had a no and a yes answer. And apparently some of the people said that, well, then that would put me into a disloyal individual. However, within the camp, the questions came up for many of the people as to what and how they should be answering those questions. There were several groups, or very early on, really questioning our confinement and whether now the legality of that confinement, whether it was really legal or not. And there was a fellow named Kiyoshi Okamoto who was really pushing the fact that what had happened to us, that our constitutional rights were being denied. He called himself the Fair Play Committee of One, pushing the story, pushing the concept that all of this is wrong. And when the draft part came out, the Fair Play Committee moved on to then use the draft as a means of them bringing about and into the courts the question of the constitutional or denial of our constitutional rights. And so the stand there taken was that if our Constitution or civil rights are returned, then we would serve in the Army. So that was the basis of that we went into the courts. But the unfortunate thing was that during the trial, that particular question was never raised, and the question then was, did you or did you not report for your physical examination? As we were beginning to decide how to have the trial, whether we were going to have a jury trial or leave it just to the judge, the group decided that it would probably be better because we didn't know what the sympathy of the people being on the jury would be, so it was selected that we would turn it over to the judge instead of having a non-jury trial. But unfortunately, it turned out that we later find out that the judge was a bit of a racist, and during the trial he did call us Japs, and so and it turned out that I guess the judge was not sympathetic at all to our cause.
States. After the signing of Executive Order 9066, over 100,000 Japanese people were forced out of their homes with no possessions to return to. Fred Korimatsu, however, planned to stay behind while his parents prepared to report for transportation to the camp. Korimatsu had surgery done to alter his appearance to a Spanish and Hawaiian person, as well as change his name to Clyde Sarah. On May 30th, 1942, the FBI arrested Korimatsu, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, for failing to report to the relocation center. He decided to allow the American Civil Liberties Union, or the ACLU, to represent him in court and challenge the constitutionality of the government's order. Korimatsu was tried in federal court in San Francisco for violating military orders under Executive Order 9066. He was given 5 years probation and was sent to an assembly center in San Bruno. Eventually transported to a camp in Utah, Korimatsu's attorneys requested the trial's court decision in the United States Courts of Appeals, who agreed that he had violated military orders. After asking to hear the case, on December 18, 1944, 6-3, judges ruled that this was a military necessity, not based on race. One of the judges, Hugo L. Black, argued that compulsory exclusion of large groups of citizens from their homes, except under circumstances of direct emergency and peril, is inconsistent with our basic governmental institutions. But when, under conditions of modern warfare, our shores are threatened by hostile forces, the power to protect must commensurate with the threatened danger. Team. 1 year after signing the Executive Act 9066, FDR activated the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Made up of mostly Hawaiian-born Nisei or second-generation Japanese Americans, they trained for combat for nearly a year. Many of the men were sent to Europe as replacements for the 100th Infantry Battalion, which was another Japanese-American unit fighting overseas. Despite that, enemy aliens could not join the Army. They went on to be the most decorated unit for size and length of service in the United States military. On April 22, 1944, they were transferred to Europe for their first assignment. They arrived in Italy, where they fought alongside the 100th Division against German soldiers. They fought with the 92nd Infantry Division, a Black American unit, and drove German forces out of northern Italy. Again, in September, the southern France, the 422nd Regimental Combat Team helped in liberating French cities under the Nazi regime. Their motto was, "Go for broke," which meant put everything aside for the win, a motto very fitting for every marginalized person. Despite the anti-Japanese racism at home, they still fought courageously, sustaining for what truly meant to be a fight for freedom. A freedom they might not have for a long time, but a time that was hoped to come. Act. On August 10, 1988, former President Reagan signed in the Civil Liberties Act into Congress, but stressed that a grave injustice had been done to their Japanese American citizens during 1942 to 1945, when America entered World War II. The act paid the internment camp survivors $20,000 to atone for the government's immoral actions towards them. Their government issued a formal apology, Reagan stating, "It is not for us today to pass judgment upon those who may have made mistakes while engaged in that great struggle, yet we might recognize that the internment of Japanese Americans was just that, a mistake." As if waiting 40 years for an apology wasn't bad enough, you can't pay your way to purity. You can't wipe away the blood of tears, no matter how many dollar bills you use. The deaths, the trauma, 3 years of thousands of lives wasted just because their enemy was Japanese. That all meant that people with heritage from Japan, immigrated or U.S. born, weren't loyal. The U.S. government made a rash decision that will forever stay in history. They failed their Japanese citizens. They failed their Asian citizens. Anti-Asian racism is still very rampant almost 80 years later, with Asian Americans being hate crimed and killed because people are misinformed with hundreds of years old lies and myths, saying that they should go back to where they came from. These events, Executive Act 9066, Manzanar, Korematsu versus the United States, has been led up to and have led to injustice that Asian Americans face today in the U.S. We should never try to sugarcoat or hide the evil in our past, but always work for an honest, ethical, and liberated future.